We recently had a video on Dickinsonia and how on earth it moved. That led to a whole pile more questions and comments, and this is an attempt to get into some of that, and especially the nature of the microbial mats in the Ediacaran. Hello everyone!
Hello!
So, we promised you a sort of follow-up to that Dickinsonia movement video that got so many comments, which was lovely to see. Thank you, everyone. We still haven't got round answering all of them, of course, but one of the things we wanted to do was have a discussion of some of the things that came out of it and came up in the comments. So, this is an attempt to do that. And we can't possibly answer everyone's points here, I'm afraid, so apologies if we've missed you. But there were quite a lot of recurring themes and sort of overlapping ideas that we thought would make a really interesting basis for discussion. Didn't you agree?
I agree, so that's what we're going to do in this video, however long it gets.
Not that long, surely. We'll see.
No more than 2 or 3 hours, probably.
Good. Hope you got a cup of tea. I might need a bigger one. Right. So, there's a critical first step, isn't there? Because there are lots of bits of discussion of things like the potential mechanisms for lifting off the mat and all the rest of that. But they all depend on there being a requirement that it had to actually lift off and not trawl across the surface. Mm-hmm. And that depends on the nature of the mats.
Yeah, this is quite crucial. I mean, first, well, was there a mat there? That's one of the things we'll be discussing. And then, how thick might it have been? What was the texture like? How long might it have taken to develop? That might be quite important too. So we'll have a discussion and see where we get to.
Indeed. And we have prepared slightly for this, allegedly, in that we've been to our local Ediacaran site. It's not a famous Ediacaran site, because there aren't any even vaguely animal-like fossils there at all. But there are microbial mats.
Yep.
And we have a few little loose blocks that happen to fall into our bags, and they look like this. So this is microbial mat texture on the surface of, is it very fine sand or is it mud? Yeah, very, very fine sand, I think.
Okay, so would that have been the surface of the seafloor at the time, or is that the sediment that buried the seafloor? Which way up was that?
This was actually the upper side, but there was a similar impression on the layer below.
Yeah.
So this is basically a bedding plane, that's a little microfault there. That step is actually where the rock has been shifted around. But you had a surface here which had the impression on both the upper and the lower surface.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's an interesting thing, and you've got a definite sort of linear fabric, and within that there are little sort of bobbles. So they're often chains of 2 or 3 little lumps forming a linear fabric, or more.
Yeah, and sometimes those are interpreted as gas bubbles. Whether they are or not is not the subject of this video.
No, I mean, I think that Alex Liu's stuff has basically been coming much more on towards a biological origin, and probably in the form of little microbial colony growths, something like that. And then superimposed on that you have this wrinkle structure, which is likely the interaction of a sticky seafloor with the ambient currents and water flow and so on. And that is not somewhere where you get Dickinsonia. The Ediacara biota as a whole, and particularly the Ediacara hills, is quite different. It's coarser sand, and you don't see quite those textures in it.
No, but you do get textures that are interpreted as microbial mats.
You do, sort of elephant skin wrinkle marks, generally larger scale, a bit more diffuse, I think.
Well, if you read Lydia Tarhan's paper, which we're going to be discussing extensively, there's quite a variety of structures that have been interpreted as microbial mats, which I think is a perfectly reasonable interpretation.
Yep. I think that's reasonable. Yeah. And in fact, might as well mention now because I've got another bit from there. One of the things that turns up in these deposits is you get layers like this, which are full of rip-up clasts. So these are not actually coherent sediment surface. They are lumps of the mat that have been torn up and then redeposited as bits of mat. Yeah. Bits of mat-bound sediment, effectively.
Yeah, so there's the sediment bound together by the mat, and of course it's the sediment that's preserved as a separate lump. But again, in the Ediacara hills, Tarhan's paper shows that you get all these rip-up clasts, and sometimes they're folded or torn, which is not right for just a lump of sediment. It's got to be a lump of sediment bound by something, so it's got a texture almost like cloth or something. Not that strong, but something coherent.
Yeah, it's basically a thin sheet. In order to be folded, it's got to be something thin.
Yeah,
which is interesting, because when you're talking about microbial mats in general, there's a lot of variation within them.
Oh yes.
And we're familiar with the sort of things that grow in puddles in the summer, and if you see them on the seaside, for example, particularly in areas above the high tide where you get a pool of water that's stagnant, doesn't get disturbed, and over a few days you get this sort of biofilm growing. Mm-hmm. And those can be extremely thin, very soft structures. But you can also get quite different types of mats, can't you?
Oh yes.
Here's one that lots of little tiny things prepared earlier. So, in this case, we have a stromatolite. It is a compound structure which is constructed by billions of microorganisms that basically form a sticky surface. And microbes are often secreting mucus and stuff like that. Sediment washes over it, gets stuck to it, and that leads to it going a bit dark for the things that don't want it to be dark. So you have cyanobacteria in the upper layer which are photosynthetic. So they grow through that layer of sediment and make more sticky stuff. And the layer grows up and up and up.
So you end up with a sort of pillar formed very gradually by microbes.
And some of the reefs in the Ediacaran, or the Precambrian in general, are, I think, kilometres tall.
It's ludicrous, some of them.
So that is a stromatolite, and that is the dominant
construction, I suppose.
Yeah, organic construction that we get in the Ediacaran, or in the Precambrian as a whole. Mm. So we don't see anything like this in the Ediacaran biotas.
No.
What does that mean?
It means you weren't getting the mat sort of successively growing in one place, I suppose. That possibly the sediment that was getting deposited was actually killing the mat off. So you end up with sort of dead mat, bit of sediment, and then another mat grows on top.
Yeah, the critical thing with getting stromatolites is that it takes time. It takes time without sediment input, or at least without a lot of sediment input. You need a tiny bit to enable it to actually build up, but it basically takes a long time.
And at the Ediacara site, some of the beds of sediment are very thin, sort of millimetres, and some of them are much thicker, sort of centimetres, or even tens of centimetres, some of them, I think.
Yep.
So, yeah, you have 10 centimetres of sediment dumped on top of you and you're a mat, you're dead, basically.
But to be honest, even a millimetre of sediment dumped on top of you would smother the mat.
Yeah.
So we're not seeing anything like stromatolites there, which means that we've got limited time between sediment inputs.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense for the environment of deposition. If you've got quite shallow water sandstone, there's certainly wave action because you get ripples. Do you get evidence of tides there?
I think so, yes. Okay. Yeah.
So you're probably getting sediment washed in and dumped pretty often. And one of the unusual things about this deposit is you don't seem to have a lot of erosion of previously deposited sediment.
Yeah.
You go to something like a shallow shore face environment in Phanerozoic, post-Cambrian, and you'd expect to see sort of remains of ripples, but you'd expect to see those ripples to have been eroded a bit, their tops, and then more sediment dumped on top. And that doesn't seem to be what you see.
This is actually a really important point, I think, that we will come back to, which is that when you have sediment building up more or less continuously without an actual barrier forming a surface, then it doesn't split along that plane. You have sediment which is continuous. And if you go to sandy environments today, generally, you have just layers of sediment. There might be fine laminations within them with slightly different grain size, but there's no actual surface, which is a consistent structure between one layer and the next.
Yeah, in general, if you've got some sort of surface, it's because you've had a big change in sediment type with a considerable sediment thickness. So mudstone to sandstone, something like that.
So when you see microbial mats like this, then which have definite textured surface, and you can see it's obviously broken along that plane and not through any other plane in here, that's telling you that this took a substantial amount of time to deposit a structure on the surface that allowed it to differentiate from one bed to the next.
Okay, how much time are we talking about here? Because if we're thinking about years or decades, you'd expect a really big thickness of mat, and maybe you would be getting stromatolites.
Exactly.
And we're not talking about a few hours because there wouldn't be time.
Yeah, it really depends on the growth of microbial organisms and their colonies. If those little bubbles on that surface are actual individual colonies that are growing out, which is probably the best explanation for most of them, I think, then think of what grows in Petri dishes. It might take a few days to a week or so to grow to that sort of structure. So we're looking at reasonably long intervals where it's quiet, and then you get more sediment coming in afterwards. It's not continuous. And you think of the biofilms we've seen in puddles and so on, and we know how long those have been there because we know how long it was since it last rained. And it's usually a week or so, and you get a thick, fluffy film of sort of algal-like stuff covering the surface.
Of course, one thing it's important to think about here is that sediments have generally been compacted. So you might have started with, a metre of sediment, it might now be 50 centimetres just because of the sediment piled on top of it. Possibly with the ediacaran stuff, there might not have been that much compaction for some of it because the fossils tend to be preserved in relief. So the same shape that they were during life, we assume. So some of it maybe hasn't been that much compacted.
Yeah, that's probably true, especially
Yes.
in the sandstones where there's evidence of early cementation. So, but if there was compaction, then it might lead to wrinkling of surfaces, for example. So some of these might not actually been during deposition. You might have effects which are secondarily imposed on bedding surfaces that were bound by sticky organic stuff. And the reason we're going into all this is because the huge question is whether Dickinsonia could have moved over the surface or through the surface of this this undersea world without leaving a trackway just from its passing. Now, there was one lovely comment in the on the last video showing that, or saying that in modern microbial mats, in Dave's experience, you can have a leaf falling onto this mat and leaving a nice clear impression on the surface. That's the sort of structure that we've been envisaging based on what we see in these puddles with... next time we're out and we'll see this in future years, we'll get photos and so on. But you see little trails of tiny snails that have ploughed through it and completely destroyed the mat. But if it was a really tough sort of mat, something which had taken a while to develop and became really quite rubbery and consistent, then theoretically you could have something going over it much more easily without leaving a trace. So that's why this is all important.
So I suppose one of the things to look at is you've got the Dickinsonia and the impressions it's left by whatever means.
Footprints. Yeah.
Footprints,
That's what they call them.
Obviously it's a foot, yes. So do you, in the same beds, get anything that's a definite trail?
Yes.
On the exact same bedding surfaces?
Yes.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
So this goes to... well, we've been looking at quite a few papers again, but we particularly like, it's got to be said, the work of Lydia Tarhan. We think they're really well argued, well structured, and lots of detail. So
well documented papers, yes.
Well done, Lydia.
Yes.
Don't actually know her, but anyway, I'm sure she won't mind. So there's a few papers that are relevant here, but there's one in particular looking at the sedimentology of the Napina Pound group, I think it was, the Microbiota, South Australia, looking at differences in structures that you get on different bedding surfaces, how those bedding surfaces are defined, And one of the things that she was finding regularly was substantial numbers of small Dickinsonia during a sort of colonisation event, coinciding on bedding planes with these helminthoidicnites is the normal name for them, these little trails or burrows. Now, it must be said that these little burrows are believed to be, in many cases, undermat trails rather than overmat. So it's something that's moving just underneath the surface and leaving a trail behind it, and the mat then sort of sinks in below it, I guess.
I think you get a variety, you get them sort of preserved as concave down, so as hollows, and some concave up. And this is, I don't quite know the arguments, but that's interpreted as being evidence that they were moving under the mat.
I think maybe moving under and then going over. So the difference is because it's displacing the mat in different ways.
Could be, yeah.
Now, these are normally interpreted as having been made by animals. I'm not sold on that at all because ricerians, but
for the purposes of today's video, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. There is something small, and we're talking millimetre or two wide, I think, normally, which is meandering through this and leaving impressions in the mat, with the sediment displaced to either side. That's one of the interesting things about this helminthoidicnites, is that it's a sort of a trench with a little mound of sediment either side of where it was moving. So it's pushing sediment aside as it's going along.
Very differently displacing sediment.
Yeah. So that is something tiny, which is going through these things on the same surfaces at the same time as Dickinsonia was colonising it, apparently, and creating these obvious trails, trace fossils. So I am having great difficulty imagining that being a tough, sort of leathery structure, which a Dickinsonia can move over the surface of and not make a dent. And other tiny little soft body things can move over and under the surface of this mat and leave great big trails behind.
Yeah, and Dickinsonia, some of them were very hefty.
Yeah, they were. I mean, we're talking about small ones in this one, I think a few centimetres or so, but even that.
That's probably bigger than whatever was making these trails.
By a couple of orders of magnitude.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's something else as well, because if this is a tough mat, then leaving an impression in it means that this thing is being etched into it. It's digesting it in situ, which is one of the arguments that's being made, that Dickinsonia is sitting there and digesting down for days at a time, probably, creating this scar in the mat as it eats through the mat.
One of the problems with that idea is, okay, you've got your mat, Dickinsonia eats its way through the mat and into the underlying sediment and somehow leaves a perfect impression in quite coarse sand.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it eats its way through part of the mat and just leaves enough to make a nice impression.
It's a tricky one. I mean, this goes back to this thing I raised earlier about you need a boundary, some sort of physical barrier, in order to have clear sedimentological break. Now, when you split these layers, or nature splits it, you have a nice clear impression with a sort of very steep edge and all the detail of it, and it is a perfect surface. So if you are interpreting this as the mat has been eaten through by Dickinsonia, even most of the way through, then that means that there shouldn't be a clear surface that it breaks along. It should be continuous sediment above and below, because you've then removed the barrier.
So you pretty much have to have at least a bit of mat to get the impression of the Dickinsonia.
Which means that these mats are quite thick.
Mm.
And these mats being thick, because it's got to be thicker than the depth of the impressions of the footprints.
Mm.
So you'd be looking at something like a millimetre or so thick mat. And how long does that take to grow?
Well, maybe a week or so if you use modern puddles as an analogy, which is, of course, totally reasonable. Different organisms, different environment, different time.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. Mm.
But so at that point, you have to start looking at the sedimentology and seeing what you can say about the environment, the rate of deposition, that sort of thing, from the rocks themselves. And that's again what this paper by Tarhan et al. Was actually mainly about. And it's really striking that you have lots of fine scale, what they call shims, which are very thin layers of fine sand, millimetre or sub-millimetre thick, and then thicker ones as well. But there are ripple marks. It's clearly a very active environment. And yet, as Lucy mentioned, it doesn't seem to be any trace of of truncation of the sediment layers. There's no erosion.
And another really unusual thing is if they're excavating at this place, you can actually take these very thin shims out as sort of pieces separate from the beds below and above, and then take them away and reconstruct them elsewhere. That's not something you can do with thin beds in a Phanerozoic sandstone in almost all cases. I'm not sure I've ever seen anywhere I could have done that. So there's something different about these ediacaran sandstones.
Definitely. There are some similarities, and in fact, I'll just quote a little bit of the paper.
Oh yeah, go for that.
Mat grounds thus performed a role similar to that of cohesive, poorly bioturbated mudstones and siltstones in Paleozoic heterolithic succession, so ones in which the rock type or the sediment type is changing. In which the presence of cohesive fine-grained sediment stabilised the substrate sufficiently to promote capture of superficially and very shallowly produced trace fossils and to resist erosion in conjunction with deposition of and casting by the overlying sandstone bed.
And that's something you often see in the Phanerozoic. You will have had a bed of mud in which organisms were burrowing or wandering over the surface or whatever, leaving traces, and you've had a lot of sand dumped on top, and the sand effectively casts these traces. So when the mudstone erodes away, because it tends to be softer than sandstone, you're left with these lovely casts on the bottom of the sandstone bed. And that's actually one of the things we're trained as geologists to look for, because they're very useful for working out things like current directions and are your beds the right way up, or have they been overturned, and paleo environment and all sorts of things. It's very, very common. But it's not quite what you see in the ediacaran.
No, but it does preserve lovely detail of trace fossils.
Oh yes.
For example, a lot of our evidence for animal behaviour is from trace fossils, and we look for that sort of horizon. So there you've got a sticky, cohesive mud layer. Mm-hmm. There's no biofilms involved as far as we know.
Well, maybe. How would one tell?
Yeah, the biofilms are not so common in the Phanerozoic, especially in normal marine conditions, because things are eating them all the time. But in general, it looks like it's sedimentary layers where it's just the stickiness of the mud that is giving you that surface. And what she's saying here is that what you're seeing is basically mimicking that in the ediacaran. So it's not sticky sediment, it's very fine sand. And yet it is generating the same sort of result. So there's something sticking the sediment together. And that's about as far as you can go. We're not seeing stromatolitic buildup. Yeah.
Well, it's not quite sticking the sediment together, it's sort of holding the sediment together, because you can still deform it, you can make impressions in it.
Yeah.
So it's not totally cemented, it's not a hard ground.
Yes. Yes, sticking as in stickiness rather than...
cohesive.
Yeah, yes. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, so you've got organic material in the form of a biofilm, presumably, which... she does actually say that is the most parsimonious solution. It's not necessarily the only one. There could be other organic stickiness going on in a world without grazers and detritivores and all the rest of it, but we'll assume it's biofilms, which are basically just making the upper level of these beds effectively coherent and immune to easy erosion. Obviously, it does get eroded because you have piles of disarticulated clasts and so on. But most of the time it doesn't. And every new amount of sediment that comes in, rather than being reworked and turned into ripples, gives you another thin layer of sediment on top. Mm-hmm. And if you look at these modern shallow marine environments today, that happens with every tide.
Oh, yeah.
So we're looking at sort of 6, 12-hour type cycles. Mm-hmm. And so what we're looking at here seems to be bedding planes in which you get Dickinsonia and trace fossils made by tiny little things on the same surfaces. We've got very thin layers of sediment which are coming in presumably very frequently. There's no evidence this is storm generated. It looks like it's generally tidal zone.
Well, some of the sediment layers are thin and some are thicker.
Yes.
Yeah. And there are actually several different, what we call fasci, sort of sedimentary environments preserved, and we're sort of treating them all as one because we want this video to last longer than, shorter than 4 or 5 hours, so.
Yeah, we would have to go and actually see it ourselves and look at exactly how much it varies. But yeah, there are thicker layers and thinner layers, and that's what you get within a lunar cycle as well, because neap and spring tides give you different sedimentary dynamics, different weather conditions give you thicker and thinner beds. But the point I'm trying to make that even the thinnest beds are preserved as extra layers of sediment.
Yes.
It's not being reworked, it's not being mixed at any point, you're just getting the progression of one layer on top of another every time there's a sediment influx. Which means that I cannot see any way that these things could have been tough, leathery mat grounds that would have resisted any impressions. It looks to me like when you have these footprints of Dickinsonia, it's what you would expect from something resting on the surface and its own weight making an impression.
That makes sense to me, yes. Okay, but since we definitely know that Dickinsonia could make multiple footprints, how did it get from one footprint to the other if it didn't cross the surface of the mat?
Yeah, okay.
Or did it cross the surface of the mat and magically leave no trace?
On to question 2 of our notes.
We made notes because we're organised.
Are we?
Oh, yes.
Oh, good. That's news to me. So the first question then is, was this thing actually digesting the mat?
Well, all right. It looks like it was. I mean, you've got this nice Dickinsonian fashion that's gone through the mat, or at least a long way into the mat.
Has it really? Or has it just impressed into the surface? Because we're not seeing anywhere a hole through the mat. We're not seeing anywhere where the sediment doesn't split along that plane.
Do you see anywhere where you've got a bit, the middle of the Dickinsonian fashion, and the outside is obscured by the mat having grown back?
Don't think so. There are some of the older impressions have less well-defined features, but I think that's just across the board.
Okay.
I don't think you see anything with well-defined in one bit and the mat growing in at the edges.
So it's probably then wasn't growing in at the edges.
Doesn't look like it to me. I think if it is growing back after having been eaten, and that the reason that the rock never is sort of continuous sediment through the middle of it, it would have to be that the mat was just sort of growing from waterborne particles, which then just colonise the whole thing simultaneously.
So I think you then still expect to see the odd one with a few gaps.
Yeah.
Which I don't think you see. So the mat either just having been compressed or grown back from remnants that were there over the whole impression does seem to make sense from what is observed.
Yes. The other thing is at the edges of these impressions, when the footprints are fairly deep, what you don't see is a break through it. It just seems to be bent down to give you the impression.
Well, that's interesting. Yes.
As far as I'm aware, and it may be that nobody has bothered illustrating it for whatever reason, but I don't see any examples where there is an abrupt step. It looks like it's the edges of the impression, as if you'd taken something heavy and sort of flumped it gently onto it. If it was digesting it, I mean, the other thing is, how thick could these mats be? Could those mats have actually been occupying the uppermost millimetre or 2 millimetres of any sedimentary layer and not leave any trace? We're not seeing any organic rich layers on the surface of this. It's just sand. The impression of the map that we're getting is wrinkle marks on the surface of these sandy layers. We're not seeing dense organic structures within the surface levels.
That's true, but these rocks have been extensively weathered.
They have. But even so, and I'd expect to see different mineralisation. For example, we know there was some pyritisation going on, and more of various people's work, including Lydia Tarhan, show so that over the surface of some of these fossils you do get pyritised bits, and I think in the White Sea you do get pyritic filaments.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's a thin layer on the surface, but the White Sea is quite a different type of preservation and ecology to some extent as well. We get much finer detail in the White Sea fossils, but you don't get so much of the trace fossil evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit of a balance. But in the Ediacara biota, at least, you don't seem to get the any direct evidence that I can see, any layer of pyritization which would indicate that there was organic material in that surface layer.
Mm.
I don't know for sure that that's correct. I mean, it's worth reiterating that we are not immersed in this field. We're not researchers that are actively studying it and would know all the literature. So it is possible we miss things.
And it's also, we've never seen these things ourselves, so we're basing all this on other people's descriptions.
We've seen specimens and we've seen a few of the UK sites, for example, but we've not been to Ediacara Hills. But yeah, so we're trying to make sense of what we've seen published rather than being the actual on-site expert.
Yeah. Okay, so what we do know is we got Dickinsonia, we seem to have some sort of mat, and Dickinsonia sometimes sat on the mat, to coin a phrase.
Like a cat.
Like a cat. That was fat.
Carry on.
I forgot where I was going with that. Yeah, and it left an impression. And sometimes Dickinsonia seems to have moved a short distance. Now, if it wasn't eating the mat, but was just sitting there absorbing stuff from the water or photosynthesizing or whatever it's supposed to have done, why did it bother moving?
Yeah. Indeed. Because it seems to have been something deliberate, as several of you have pointed out, that it's too regular a movement trail for it to have been just sort of accidentally picked up every now and then. There's something structured about the way it moved. So if it wasn't digesting the mat, and I don't actually see any evidence that it was.
Or not the whole mat anyway.
Yeah, not a significant part of it. Then could it have been directly dependent on gases released by the mat, or could it be osmotically feeding on particles that are being given off by the mat by water flowing through the sediment, for example? That's been another suggestion.
Okay, what sort of gases would these be?
Something like methane, for example. It could have been a methanotroph. Hydrogen sulfide. Within a microbial mat, there will be in the subsurface different microbes producing different types of gases. And it is quite possible to have metabolism either of the organism itself or of symbiotic microorganisms within it that help to provide food source. So there could be some sort of dependence on gases or dissolved particles, tiny things, given off by the mat directly.
Yeah, okay, so Dickinsonia in some way getting nutrition from something produced by the mat.
Yes.
Would make sense. So it sits there, it absorbs the gases or food particles or whatever, and then that's used up, and so it needs to move. But it doesn't need to move very far.
Exactly. It just needs to move to a different bit of mat.
That would make sense. Okay, we're back to how did it move to a different bit of mat without leaving a trace then?
We are.
I mean, could it be that the mat was sort of buoyancy enough that you could move over it without leaving a trace, but if you sat there for any length of time, you compacted it?
Ooh.
But we come back to the trace fossil evidence then, where something just moving through very differently did leave a trace.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And these, as I say, are the same bedding surfaces. There's not much doubt that tiny things moving did leave traces. So it would need some way of preventing itself from leaving a trace for whatever reason. Now, there have been some suggestions in the comments. So one of them is, could it have been using cilia? So just a surface covered by cilia for which there is potentially some evidence. There are little fibrous markings in the impressions of some of the best preserved ones from Russia. But if you've got enough cilia just forming a sort of millions of tiny feet underneath it, could that hold it above the surface so that it somehow didn't leave a trail? What do you think of that one?
Well, cilia tend to be very short because they're subcellular structures. So you wouldn't be lifting yourself very far. So if the mat had any thickness, which it must have done because it's being compacted, it just seems a bit unlikely that no Dickinsonia would have ploughed through the mat a bit.
Yeah, and the closest I think we've ever seen is that there's a few examples where you get a couple of tiny sort of ridges or grooves which are a bit intermittent behind it, sort of almost like tiny drag marks, but they're little lines nowhere near the full width of the animal. And the other thing is, even if it's got cilia, it's the weight that matters. If these things are actually negatively buoyant, they're going to sink. Then it would presumably still be distributing its weight over its surface area. And if that weight is enough to leave the impression in the mat when it's stationary, it's hard to see how it could not be sufficient to leave an impression when it's moving.
Yeah, in at least some cases, I think.
Yeah.
Given that you would have had mats that had been existing for various lengths of time, and so some of them at least would have been squidgy enough, you would think.
Yeah.
To take the impression of a Dickinsonia.
Yeah, especially as we see that at multiple stages of the movement, it is leaving impressions when it's stationary. So, yeah, it's not as if it was... The timing was important because these are multiple times where it's always leaving impressions.
Yeah, so okay, so we're back to Dickinsonia moved. We're going to get to a new bit of mat. It didn't seem to move over the surface of the mat.
We haven't got to there yet.
Oh,
There's another suggestion.
Oh, go on,
no.
go on.
No, so not cilia.
Right.
What about mucus? What about a sort of blanket of mucus on the underside, which it then glides along? So think about the rocks in Death Valley, for example, and leaving very little trace. And you can have boulders like this sliding along when there's exactly the right film of water and ice, I think it is. I'll have to look up the exact reason, but it was finally explained. These things can move hundreds of metres, like on a skating rink.
But don't they actually leave traces? And that's how it was detected?
Yes.
For those particular rocks?
Yes, but this is a large rock leaving a small trace.
Yeah, okay.
But someone actually did point out that they went looking, and there are things today, like the sea hare, which is a type of shellless gastropod, sea slug basically, that produces a large puddle of mucus, which it just sort of glides along on, and leaves very little trace behind it. Apparently they do actually pick up the loose sediment and it goes over them like a conveyor belt or something, which is a bit weird. But that, of course, is an environment with loose sediment. Here, there's not so much loose sediment. Although, the mucus argument has been suggested. And Ivantsov, again, he's published an awful lot, has argued that you get little ridges in some cases of sediment around some of the Dickinsonia impressions, which he thinks is a sort of sloughing off of mucus coats, which have picked up sediment and end up as a pile around it.
That's a really interesting suggestion.
It is. There are also sort of smeared trace fossils of other organisms. So I think Kimberella, which we know almost certainly was moving, does leave these sort of weird smeared things which don't leave clear impressions, but there's a sort of smeary bit behind it with irregular lines that looks like it was mucus lined.
Okay, and Kimberella, am I right in thinking you don't get that at Ediacra?
No, you do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yes.
Do you get trace fossils of Kimberella there?
That I'm not sure of.
I don't know either. It's something we'd have to look up.
And I think it's relatively rare, so it might be single beds or something like that, where conditions may have been different.
Okay.
It's where you also get the Kimbericnus, which is these scratch marks that are believed to be associated with Kimberella.
So that might have to be another video someday.
Kimberella's definitely another video. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I do like this mucus idea. It does have legs, if you'll pardon the expression.
It doesn't have legs, no. But it's the best explanation I think I've come across. And the question then is, could that prevent a sort of wide trackway of just displacement? If resting on the mat leads to a detailed, relatively deep impression, and would moving over it also produce an impression, just sort of pushing the sediment away slightly?
Again, you'd expect it to happen possibly at least some of the time.
You would.
Especially perhaps because the sort of trails of Dickinsonia footprints, they've always got very sharp edges, haven't they? Not blurred at the edges.
Pretty much. Blurred in what way? Do you mind? Some are a bit faint because they're a bit old.
I'm just thinking as though something might have rolled over the edge.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything like that.
Yeah.
And when you see the impressions of the lateral furrows and so on, those are always sharp. Whereas if something had just sort of started moving, those should all be smeared.
Yeah.
So the only way around that with the mucus idea would be that it's sitting there doing whatever it does, and then it's had enough, and then it starts secreting mucus, and secretes on the underside a mass of mucus that basically lifts it up, and then it can glide away.
Like a hovercraft.
Like a hovercraft.
Of mucus.
Exactly. Lovely things, aren't they? Wouldn't you want to pet one?
It's a really intriguing idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in terms of this, it's hard to rule out. I mean, I think given that we do see these sort of apparently trace fossils that were by Kimberella, I think it was, where you have the appearance of sort of mucus trails smearing the surface, I would be surprised if this was the same thing, that it didn't do it here, that we didn't leave anything that looked convincingly similar.
Yeah, it would be a bit odd if sometime you had a very thin, easily ripped mat, and even some mucus wandering over it was enough to rip it. I don't know, maybe it's the sort of thing that someone needs to go back and actually look at the Dickinsonia again with that in mind.
Yeah. I think that's often the way things work, that things which are really obvious in hindsight are just not seen because you're not looking for it sometimes.
Yeah. But this is a YouTube video, it's not a scientific paper, so let's leave the mucus idea aside for a bit. And could Dickinsonia have been swimming?
Okay, I mean, we have no evidence for the actual swimming movement, but and this we partly covered that in the previous one, of course. It's just there's no evidence for. Well, there is evidence that it has been interpreted as muscles, the way that it can contract and so on, but that can also be interpreted in many other ways. But by swimming, do you mean just sort of lifting off?
Well, lifting off and moving either actively or passively with the current.
Yeah.
So swimming's the wrong term, really. Moving through the water column in some way.
Yeah, so this comes to the mad idea I suggested last time as being possibly a plausible one, that it just sort of lifts up at one end, then sort of becomes waterborne and then flops down again. That sort of idea.
Well, interestingly, there was a paper by Evans et al. In 2015, if I'm remembering rightly, where they got some Dickinsonia impressions, but with a bit of the edge missing, where you just got sediment. And a number of specimens, it's not just a one-off, and they interpreted this as you had a Dickinsonia on the seafloor and part of it lifted up at the edge. So you get sediment deposited under the Dickinsonia. So if they could actually lift themselves up a bit.
I've got a quibble with that one.
Go on.
Because if it was a Dickinsonia that was lying flat and then lifted up, surely where it had been, you'd leave an impression. Unless the sediment was completely mobile and as soon as it lifted up, it all flowed in. In which case, why didn't it flow in when the whole thing was lifted up?
It possibly depends. Well, if this was... Sorry, I don't understand your objection.
Well, if it was resting on the seafloor entire, it leaves an impression.
Yes, it does.
Then a bit folds up.
Yes.
And then sediment flows in that way to fill in the space where it would have left an impression.
Okay. No, you've got a Dickinsonia sitting on the seafloor and a whole load of sediment comes along and buries it.
Right.
But part of the Dickinsonia is lifted up at the edge. So it's the burial sediment that is getting in.
Oh, okay.
It's not loose sediment that happened to be lying there anyway.
Right, okay. Because I remember in one or two specimens where there was it was a very sharp edge. It didn't sort of fade out, as you might expect, if it was sort of lifted up at one part, because the sediment that's coming in should get thinner and thinner until it comes in contact with the body.
Well, you can't tell, can you?
If it's the photograph I'm remembering, it was very sharp. And it looked like the same sort of outline. But and it could also be that this thing flopped down partly folded. So it sort of ended up on the seafloor like that. And so it never made an impression of the whole thing. It was just slightly folded when it landed.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if they must have been the body fossils. Or interpreted as body fossils.
Okay, so there's probably variety of them, and I'm not quite sure we're thinking of the same one.
Possibly not. Yeah.
But there's some evidence, at least, that these things could be folded and be lifted up.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so given that this seems to be, as everyone has been saying, a very deliberate movement style, there must have been a process that controlled it.
Yes.
So we've got a couple of questions of how did it adhere to the surface? And then how did it detach?
Right. Well, the Evans et al. 2015 paper used these sort of Dickinsonia that were flipped up, however that happened, as evidence that they weren't really attached to the surface, that they were separate from the surface and so could be flipped up.
In that case, why weren't they picked up all the time, as some people have said, in a turbulent, shallow water environment? Why are they just not sort of strewn everywhere, rather than leaving nice, neat trails?
Yeah, you don't get Dickinsonia roll marks or anything like that, do you?
There are a few mangled ones, which are deformed and are thought to be transported.
Yes.
There's quite a lot of those, I think.
Yes, in some beds, yes.
Yeah, but it's very difficult if there's no way of it adhering to the surface for it not to just be picked up by every wave. Or at least not have any control over the time that it lifts up and being swept away. It's just very difficult to have that sort of order to its movement if it doesn't adhere to the surface at all.
Just trying to think how modern things do it. Things like starfish and sea urchins, they do adhere. Snails, yes.
Flatfish actually bury themselves a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah,
you probably do need to have some way of clinging on.
So, assuming that, I think you do. And one suggestion was cilia.
Maybe.
So it's got all these cilia on the underside. What it uses them for is to cling onto the mat.
Plausible.
It's actually quite reasonable, I think. And given that quite a few things, like placozoans today, are covered in cilia on the surfaces, there's reason to think that Dickinsonia might have had cilia-like structures, even if they're on a larger scale, over the surface. So yeah, something like that. Maybe even something which is a little different but based on cilia, or superficially similar but larger. Some sort of cilia-like structures.
It's possible.
Another one that Ivantsov has again been proposing is mucus. Sticks itself down with mucus.
But if it's digesting the mat, wouldn't the mucus get in the way?
So if it's digesting...
Digesting the mat or obtaining nutrition from the mat, wouldn't the mucus get in the way?
You would think so.
Unless the mucus is how it absorbs stuff from the mat.
Yes. Possibly. In which case it would have to have a way of ingesting the mucus again.
Yes.
I will say now that it turns out there is some evidence for internal structures within Dickinsoniids, possibly including Dickinsonia. Haven't quite got my head around all the literature yet, but again, mostly from Ivantsov in the White Sea stuff, where there are apparently internal structures, maybe canals, sort of diagonally going across the body and joining up with a midline, which also seems to be some sort of canal. So there was something going on internally. And this is stuff I didn't actually know much about at all, but it's something we're probably going to have to go back to in future, is more about the detailed anatomy of these things, how much we can say and what we can't. But there was something internal, and it might have been some sort of fluid distribution network for possibly digestion internally, possibly something else. So we can't really go into all that detail here because we're going to need to read a lot more paper.
Yeah.
But certainly there are suggestions that it was absorbing some of the ambient material, fluid, water, whatever, which might fit with being able to ingest mucus again, but it doesn't seem like an efficient way of doing it unless it's sort of acidic mucus that is etching the surface and then transporting nutrients into it. And so I think it's very speculative in that case. And this goes back to Ivantsov's argument again that the sediment piles around it look like they may have been from the sort of build-up of sediment stuck to the surface into mucus and then sort of sloughed off around the edges. And that, it's interesting idea. But in terms of adhering with mucus, maybe. I like the ciliar idea better.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really enough evidence to choose between the ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's purely a gut feeling at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so assuming that it did have one of these ways.
Or even was just heavy enough that it just wasn't moved by currents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did it detach? And this is where we've had a lot of really interesting comments. So well done to all of you who came up with this. Changing buoyancy.
Well, that's the thing that some plankton do, for example.
Quite a lot
help
of them.
Move up in the water column and down again.
The biggest mass migration on the planet, for those who don't know, is the diurnal migration of plankton. Things which go up and down at least a kilometre, I think, in most cases, through the day-night cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And they do this by basically secreting gases or fats within the tissues, which changes their buoyancy.
I think different organisms do different things. So, yeah.
But basically they have ways of secreting material that changes the buoyancy of the body as a whole, and it goes up or comes down.
Yep.
And so that is definitely a thing. Now, is there any evidence of Dickinsonia doing that? You could argue that that change in the diameter, where you get these sort of impressions of something being wider, and then it gets, and then you have the animal, the organism itself being smaller with the sort of trail around it, not trail,
Rim.
yeah, the rim, the impression of the rim of when it was larger, is an indication that it is changing its density because it is contracting.
Okay, so how would that work? You've got a Dickinsonia on the sediment surface.
Yeah.
And it wants to go up. So it
You would have to do the opposite.
expands outwards to make itself less dense.
Presumably by absorbing either water or possibly gases from the mat.
Well, absorbing water wouldn't help raise it up because it wouldn't make it less dense than seawater.
It wouldn't. It would
So it would have to be gas or fat or something.
Yes.
Okay, so it makes itself less dense in some way, expands itself, goes up, moves along a bit by the current, and then very quickly, presumably, because it doesn't move very far, makes itself more dense again and goes blunk.
That would be the idea.
Yeah, the going down has to be quite quick.
Yeah.
Because these are moving your one Dickinsonia length.
Yeah. And one person I think did suggest actually a raft of bubbles. That is, so you get lots of gas building up underneath it, which rises it up, lifts it off, and then as soon as it goes into the water column, the gas escapes, and it goes plump.
I like that idea. But then why do you get such a perfect impression of the underneath of the Dickinsonia? Wouldn't these bubbles have disturbed that?
Ooh. Oh, that's interesting.
And of course, I'm going to wildly speculate here.
Oh, do.
If it had these canals, suppose it sort of secreted gas into those canals, much like a nautilus secretes gas into its chambers. It rises up, moves along a little bit, then farts and comes down. There was no other word, I'm sorry.
There really was.
It releases gas very politely
Absolutely.
and comes down.
Yeah. So that sort of thing is, again, theoretically possible. It's triggered by being surrounded by water. And we don't know whether there were lots of pores over the surface that allowed connection of the internal structure to the outside. I think it's widely assumed that there were in most of the ediacarans, the fronds especially, and that they were sort of feeding osmotrophically by water going in and out of them. There could well be ways in which it could absorb gases from the mat and then release them as soon as it was waterborne.
Mm-hmm. So either making its own gas or getting it from elsewhere.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, it's a good idea, that one. I think.
It's a really interesting idea, yes.
And the one I came up with, just as a reminder, was it sort of lifts up one side by some sort of fairly passive or more, well, just a very simple sort of process, and then the wave catches it and sort of peels it up and drops it again. But if that was aided by buoyancy, or if it was replaced by buoyancy, that is a nice idea. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we've still got some unanswered questions, but they're different unanswered questions, I think it's fair to say.
I think this just shows the value of this sort of brainstorming type idea. But some of these things I have not seen mentioned in the literature as possibilities. And they are hypotheses, speculations even.
But this is a YouTube video,
Yeah.
so we can do that. We can just discuss things.
Everyone can, yes.
Yes.
And the next stage would be to think, okay, what would this predict? What would you expect to see in that case? Or can you rule out all the other options by things you'd expect to see there and don't? So the whole next phase of science is, of course, the testing of your hypotheses. And so you sort of build up a very clear model of what would be expected in any given scenario. And then you go and see if you can find evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the luxury of doing that, unfortunately, being on the other side of the world. But I know some of the people watching this actually do subscribe to, actually are academics who are working on the detachment. So that's slightly scary. Hi, Alex.
Is it too late to just not do this video?
Yeah, sorry, I've already posted it.
Oh, bother. Oh, well.
Yeah. I blame the commenters. It's all my audience's fault. We're just discussing it.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine.
So that's one of the really lovely things about the detachment. I think it's partly why it's so interesting to so many people, is that there is so much we don't understand yet, and there's no obvious modern analogue. But I think just having gone back through the literature a little bit more and trying to understand the nature of the mats, I am now much happier that there must have been some very specific way in which it didn't leave trails.
Yes.
I don't think we can just say, well, the mats were tough, it wouldn't have left trails. I don't think any of that makes sense. So, yeah. It's quite fun, isn't it?
Yeah. So why not leave your thoughts in the comments? Because we like that sort of thing.
Oh no, not again. Another 200 overnight.
And you never know, maybe we'll do another video.
You're answering some of them. And at some point we will get on to things like Kimberella as well, which is just going to be a complete comment fest.
And more graptolites, of course.
Yes, and sponges. We haven't done sponges in ages.
More sponges, yes.
Haven't done heteractinids yet.
Well, that's a treat for everyone.
Oh yeah. We also haven't done krakens.
That would be a cracking video.
I shall leave you with that interesting thought, and we'll see you again soon.